everyone. I am Shanni. You might confuse me and Chris. We're only one young one and one old one.
I thought it was the tall one. Oh, man.
Chris and I used to be mentor and mentee. I was the mentee at Bishop Fox, where we both worked in the AppSec program. Chris taught me threat modeling, architecture security, and helped me develop a slightly better sense of humor. I am now at CrowdStrike. I was not responsible for July 19th. I found out in the news just like the rest of you, and texts from all my family. I am in the advisory services division, so I help companies prepare for their July 19th. I do incident response preparation, tabletop exercises, and cybersecurity maturity assessments. And because I used to be the ethical hacker for web applications at Bishop Fox, I sometimes am also pulled in for incident response doing web applications, despite the fact that that AppSec is no longer my focus for my paid work. It is still a large interest of mine. I am on the working group of the ASVS, so come to our talk tomorrow, talking about the new version of the ASVS that will hopefully be coming out at the end of the year, maybe early next year. And I am a proud member of the Philadelphia OWASP chapter, which just started this year.
Great.
Chris?
Thanks, Shanni, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Shanni mentioned, we work together on the same team at Bishop Fox. Our relationship there started as a pairing of a mentor and a mentee, an opportunity for me to do something that I really love, which is sharing the wealth of experience that I have gained in 35 years of working in IT, most of which has been in security. Wasn't very long after that we were paired up in that way that I began to grow my team there at Bishop Fox as part of our application security practice into an area that was a little new for the company, moving away from just doing web app and mobile app pen testing into doing threat modeling and architecture review and some other things. And so immediately the first thing I did was to, for the first hire on my team, once we got those services up and off the ground, I hired her. I brought her on as my first direct report, and stayed that way until I left the company in May of what year is it? It's been a year and a half, okay? So really it was a smart move. She brought a lot. She was really super eager to learn, especially the threat modeling piece. My application security background goes back, longer than I probably should admit. I think I would say I did my first web app pen test in about 2020. Happened to be on an application that I was actually the developer of. So I was just doing it to kind of go beyond the functional and usual testing we were doing to do a little bit more dysfunctional testing. It's been quite a career for me, and one of the things I've always enjoyed doing is doing and talking and teaching threat modeling. And Shanni and I had the opportunity while at Bishop Fox to work on an engagement together that was presented to us when it was sold to the client as a threat modeling engagement. And we're thinking, oh, cool, we're going to do another application threat model for somebody, until we found out that there was a little bit different slant to it. And they weren't necessarily concerned with security. They were concerned with some very specific objectives around privacy. And I won't get into the details of that. So we had to dive into this engagement kind of new to the idea of, well, we're used to doing security threat modeling. What are we going to do? What are the kinds of threats we need to concern? She brought a lot to the table on that already. But the one thing we were not aware of at the time, and it did exist, is there was a framework for doing privacy threat modeling, which is called, and we're going to talk about it today, called LINDDUN, and that's an acronym. How many of y'all are familiar with STRIDE, right? So it's similar to that, and we'll get to the details behind that. But before we do that, we're going to do just a quick refresher. I'm going to make some assumptions that everybody's at least passingly familiar with threat modeling as it pertains to application security. And so we're going to just do a quick refresher on that. Before I do that, though, I want to give you some definitions of my interpretation of what is a threat model. So we'll start with the words. What is a threat? The possibility that something bad or harmful could happen, okay? It's a potential. What is a model? What does it mean when we say to model something? To model something is to create a description that helps us visualize something that cannot be directly observed. That's kind of the essence. I mean, I just looked this up in the dictionary, whatever. That's kind of one of the definitions of a model. If we combine those two things together, we get this. A description that's used to help visualize the possibility that something bad can happen. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this. Because we don't want to fall into this trap that threat modeling is all about applications, or it's even all about security. It's also important to note that threat modeling doesn't have to be prescriptive to a certain methodology or a certain framework like STRIDE or those things. Those things help, but I want you to keep the very base concept in mind. And there's a reason for that. As oftentimes in my experience when I'm doing threat modeling engagements for my customers, when I first started this, and they will have this tendency to fall into this trap of getting hung up on all the formalisms. Oh, is this the right direction for the data flow in a data flow diagram? Or is this spoofing? Or is this tampering? Well, it might be either one. Don't care, right? All those formalisms we can just dispense with and just keep this basic concept in mind. Are we doing something? Are we modeling the system in a way that helps us identify threats? So in this, we would use the 4 questions framework, right? We're familiar with this, Adam Shostak. I don't know if Adam's here this week yet, but I haven't seen him. Basic concept is this, right? If we're familiar with that, is what are we working on, where we want to gain an understanding of the system that we're modeling, the system that's being developed, and that we're going to analyze for potential threats. We want to ask ourselves, and this is the fun part, right? What can go wrong? We're going to identify the threats and weaknesses in that design in the context of what we're trying to achieve, right? So if it's a security threat model, it's about what kinds of attacks and things might be subject to that might compromise the data, compromise the availability, et cetera. What can we do about it? How do we fix what we find that might be wrong? And finally, the question, did we do a good job? And we're going to go through these steps a little bit later, and we'll talk about what those mean in more detail. I'm not going to belabor the point. We're, again, mostly familiar with STRIDE, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. It's a mnemonic device that allows us to brainstorm and elicit threats when we're doing a security-based threat modeling. And the security properties that they align with, shown on the right there, make a lot of sense, right? Spoofing an identity, that speaks to authenticity. Tampering speaks to integrity. Denial of service is pretty obvious, right? That speaks about availability, information disclosure. So we align these, each of the elements of STRIDE framework to the security property that they affect. And that's really what it's all about. So that's really our refresher on threat modeling. That's all I'm going to do on this. But we're here to talk about something different. We're here to talk about privacy-based threat modeling. And so I thought we'd highlight the difference between data privacy and data security. Data security we're mostly familiar with, right? I know for me, I've been living and breathing data security for a long time. CIA, if we got our CISSP, we learned the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. We're protecting data from unauthorized attacks or unauthorized access, breaches, malicious attacks, things like that. And the controls we apply are specific to that: encryption, access controls, multi-factor authentication, et cetera. The thing about data security, it can apply to all types of data, right? Business data, transactional data, also PII and personal data. Anything that's really important to the business, it's important to secure that data. So some of the controls around data security are familiar to all of us, right? Use strong passwords, we implement firewalls, we have network access control, network monitoring, et cetera. Key point to remember at the bottom of that left-hand column, data security is about protecting any data from threats to security properties that are required to protect that data. Data security is a prerequisite for data privacy. Advance with that one.
So now the data privacy part. And with data privacy, yes, you need data security, but this is based on not necessarily the security of the system in addition to the data, but rather all about the proper handling, processing, and storage of your personal information, or if you were the one designing the application, the personal information of not just the users of that application, but any users who might be dragged in or involved in that application. And a little later, we'll talk about what that second part means, that there can be impacted parties who are not active users of an application. Here, this is addressed not just with like privacy laws and regulation, like California's privacy law and GDPR, but also respect for an individual and to some extent reputation. You're protecting the individual's rights to privacy. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is what might be a privacy issue in one context, the same piece of information in another context does not create a privacy issue. So the most basic explanation that I like to give is the fact that I have a shani.prutchi@owasp.org email address or an account for Google with those credentials is not particularly sensitive, or even that I have a Prutchi S email address. However, if I have an email address, a valid account at something more sensitive, like if at the, Ashley, with the Ashley Madison hack. Now, I was a little too young at that point. But just knowing that a user is belonging to that service, just having the identity, the email address of a user of that service is sensitive in some contexts and not another. So when we're discussing privacy threats, we're going to be having to consider the context and also remember that there are cultural context issues, right? In a country where free speech is a right, being a contributing member to a newsletter or an open news resource is not something that the government will necessarily find threatening, depending on the administration. In certain countries in former Soviet blocs, that can get you disappeared. And it's something that has happened in the news before. And so really, we're making sure here that we have consent for data collection, there's awareness of that data collection, and also that there's transparency of that usage so that if you're not happy with how your data is used, you know how it's used and you can opt out, you cannot use the service. And as we'll see, sometimes privacy can be at odds with security. Now, this is not always the case, but really is notable in the case of non-repudiation. We'll see that in LINDDUN, non-repudiation is one of our privacy threat concerns. But in STRIDE, repudiation is one of our security concerns. And so sometimes there can be a push and pull, which is why we need to focus on is the privacy threat a privacy threat, and how at odds is it with the security of the system? So just as we have the STRIDE framework for threat modeling for secure by design, LINDDUN helps us achieve privacy by design. It was first introduced in 2010 by the team at, I don't even want to try to pronounce this, KU Leuven's Distranet Research Unit, which is an internet-based and privacy-based security research group in Europe. And this LINDDUN framework is compatible with the 4 questions framework. In fact, it is meant to be workable with STRIDE. And if you use security tooling for threat modeling, like some of the threat modeling tools, it is meant to integrate with those as well. And for ease of use and to address the different levels at one which may want to think about privacy concerns, there are 3 flavors, if you will. There's Go, which is what we're actually going to be using today. It's a very lean approach. It's meant for brainstorming privacy threats, and it relies on a rough system sketch. You don't need like a full DFD. In our case, we're going to be using like a system level 0 DFD, but this is really meant for like a whole team to kind of talk about kind of typical whiteboard hacking of threat modeling. Pro goes a little bit deeper. Here it's a systematic approach. You have a DFD, there's some resources, some mapping tables. This is really meant that you can get all of your privacy threats in a list so that you can prioritize and mitigate them. And finally, there's Maestro. This is still in development. It is listed on their website, but still actively in development. The intention with Maestro is that it will be very precise threat identification. And it will be for a specific threat type. So if I want to really focus on linking threats, I can make an exhaustive list of all of the privacy threats. And when we're considering these threats, again, we need to consider the context, right? That informs the sensitivity of the situation and also helps us later prioritize. So like STRIDE, LINDDUN is an acronym. We have linking, identifying, non-repudiation, detecting data disclosure, unawareness, and non-compliance. So we'll go through what each of those privacy threats are. We have linking, which is any time that you're able to associate different data together that reveals information about a person or a group. So here, this isn't necessarily that you can identify who that person or group is, just that you can relate that information. And linking happens through identifiers. So this might be a combination of data, profiling, derivation, or inference. So if you can say these few data points are connected, and as a result, I can infer who this user is, or I can infer that this user is the same as that user, we have linking. And the more data disclosure you have, the more linking you have, right? Because linking happens with data points. And so if I have some disclosure of data, like on Facebook, I've tagged the location of where I'm having dinner tonight, that's another piece of data that I can use to link. This can also lead to other privacy threats. So this can lead to identifying, right? If I can link data and some of that data involves some of my identification information, we can have that. We can also have detecting, who is detecting usage, and non-repudiation, where I can say for definite this person did this thing. The typical example of data linking is a browser fingerprint, right? At the end of the day, if you're searching anonymously on a website, they can track who you are, well, not who you are, they can track that the person visiting now and the person visiting a day from now looking at airplane tickets is the same person even without cookies, right? Just because if you're using the same device, they will know what is the operating system of your device, what is the browser version, what is the display size. Just with all this data, they don't know that it's Shanni Prutchi looking at airplane tickets, but they can say, oh, this was the same device that was looking at airplane tickets yesterday. We'll show a higher fee, which is why they recommend using a different device for things like that. We also have group profiling, right? And that is when you can see that one user is related in a group or a group is together. So if I live in a neighborhood where 75% of the residents have asthma, and now it's time for me to register for health insurance, my health insurance sees where I live, and they're going to charge me a higher premium. We also have identifying. So a lot of systems have to identify data subjects. That's okay. Here, identifying is when you are identifying an individual and that's not the intent or it's undesired, right? So this happens when data either refers to identity directly or it can be derived as a result of linking. And it happens when there's unnecessary information that is processed or there's content in it that is revealing or even references in the metadata to identity. And we get data linking causes this, data leaks can lead to identification or also inference. One of the points that I really like to drive home with identifying is how little data and within linking that you really need for identifying. There was a 1997 study, I think a lot of people can like reference it kind of loosely, by computer scientist LaTanya Sweeney, who's the founder of the Data Privacy Lab at Carnegie Mellon University, that found that census records, using census records, you can identify 87% of the US population just with their zip code, their gender, and their date of birth. That is insane. And so that is why identifying and linking is such a big deal. Now we have non-repudiation, which is I can say definitely Chris ate the cookies in the cookie jar. And this is this is not something we want in a privacy case. We want to be able to provide some plausible deniability, right? If I have a camera pointing at the cookie jar, I know it was Chris, right? Where else you can say the dog ate it.
Still wasn't me.
It was a deep fake. And here, your evidence is logs and metadata. Well, we know logs are a security thing, right? And so it's really a discussion of when we need to involve, when we need to track, where it may not be advantageous for the user for that to be a case. For example, if there's metadata that shows who created a file, and that file is then leaked to the media in a whistleblower case, that is really not great for the whistleblower, right? But that's something that may be of concern in the computer system if I want to know who created a file or who brought in a file that led to malware being deployed. Detecting. We are here deducing that someone is involved with a service just through observation. This can facilitate linking and identifying, since detecting can create more data points on the person. And this is just happens by observing communication flows, even side effects of the application and system responses. So if you're familiar with Stride, one of the typical kind of information disclosure threats is if you try to log into an application, the user enumeration threat of like, if I log in as like prutchi@gmail.com on Facebook or whatever, and I put the wrong password, and instead of just saying like username or password is not correct, it just tells me your password isn't correct, I can deduce that I'm a user of that service. Again, Facebook, that's not a big deal. A website that might be more controversial, probably a bigger deal. But this actually doesn't require actual data. It just is like the fact that data exists can confirm that you're involved, right? Just having like web traffic, not knowing what's in the web traffic, can show that that's a service that you're involved with. And because this is so like kind of nebulous, it's specifically for super sensitive behavior or information. We can detect that I'm here at OWASP or that I'm in San Francisco because I was on a flight, right? But like that's not particularly sensitive unless I were like trying to defect from a country. Data disclosure. This is when a system is unnecessarily or excessively collecting, storing, processing, or sharing personal data. So excessively is the key point, excessively or unnecessarily. Systems need to collect personal data in some cases, but here it's when they're doing it and they don't need to do it. So it happens with unnecessary data types, which is we're just collecting like data that's too sensitive or too granular and isn't necessary for the service we're providing. Excessive data volume, which is we're taking too much or too frequent amounts of data. Unnecessary processing, so we're processing data that doesn't need to be processed or retaining it for too long of a period. And excessive exposure, we're sharing it with too many parties. And you avoid this by sticking to the data minimization principle. Just don't use, collect, process, share data that you don't need, right? Like my dieting app doesn't need my location, right? Like maybe they want my tracking for like a Ring or a Fitbit or something like that, but they really don't need my location. They can just take the calorie expense data from my Fitbit. And with data disclosure, as we know, the more data that's disclosed, the better chance at linking and identifying we have. Unawareness and unintervenability. So this is really, you aren't aware that your data is being processed, shared, collected, whatever, and you don't get a say in it. So not aware is pretty clear. You're not being told, or you're not being told in clear language. Like terms of service, great, who reads them? Yeah. If it's not clear language, definitely not technical people, but also definitely not lay people are reading that and understanding what the implications are. But we also have being able to consent to that, right? So now we typically see opt out, but if you really want to be privacy forward, opt in. I should be able to opt into having my data processed, not that being the default. And finally, non-compliance. Here, this is not following security and data management best practices, standards, and legislation. So there's the following the legislation part, which is when you are breaking GDPR or some other regulation. But also there's bad security hygiene, bad security risk management, where if you have information disclosure or a data leak because you have bad access controls, that's non-compliance, right? But the thing to be aware of is this is only applicable when it leads to other LINDDUN threats. Yeah. So if you're if you are in cybersecurity non-compliance, that you don't have proper logging, that doesn't really impact LINDDUN. So that's not a huge concern. But here we can see where security can tie in to privacy. Without proper security of a system, you're going to leak data, you're going to lead to access control issues, things like that. Then that's when that becomes a privacy threat. So LINDDUN Go is one of the flavors we have of LINDDUN. And it's a card game. I wouldn't necessarily call it a game. It is a very useful deck of cards. It is intended for brainstorming threats. It is the leanest way to use LINDDUN. And with this, you only need a simple sketch of the system, which we will be showing you for our sample library system. And it contains 33 privacy threats across all of our privacy categories. And each one corresponds to an individual card. So you draw a card, which Chris and I will be doing a little later on, and say, here's our threat, let's start talking about it. And it is a great way to start identifying those privacy threats. So what does that card look like? So here's a sample card for linkable user requests. What are the parts of it? We have the title, pretty self-explanatory. Then we have the hotspot. We're going to go a little bit into more detail about what hotspots are soon, but this is basically where the threat happens, where you would find that. Then we have the threat source. Where's the threat coming from? Your two options are up there. It's organizational, so internal, or external. Is it coming from like an external entity that you're sending to a third party, or is this something that is happening within the system? And then description, a brief explanation of what the threat is. And elicitation questions. Asking these questions helps you determine if the threat is applicable to our system. And if you see this, no, okay, we can pass the card along. And then we have examples, just examples of when this occurs that may help you figure out if this is a thing to be aware of, and consequences, why this threat matters. If this threat is present in the system, what can it lead to? Additional information, so just provide some additional context, and finally, a card identifier. This is just the letter, so LINDDUN, and the number so that you can easily reference it later on. And so now we will talk about hotspots.
Thanks, Shanni. All right, so as Shanni mentioned, one of the key parts of the cards in the LINDDUN card deck, the LINDDUN Go card deck, is called a hotspot. And this is one of the things that makes this kind of threat modeling a little bit unique from our traditional security-based threat modeling where we're applying STRIDE to a DFD. And one of the things that's typically included in a DFD when you're doing like STRIDE framework for security threat modeling is the concept of the trust boundary. That trust boundary delineates where trust or privilege levels differ from one entity in the diagram to another. That's really important. That's an important place to focus your thinking about security threats on here. But that's not really our concern as much in privacy threat modeling. So instead of the trust boundaries, we have these things called hotspots. And they're made up of a few different elements. Some of them are going to sound a little familiar. We've got a process, we've got a data store, we've got directional flows, which sound a lot like DFD stuff. We'll get to that and we'll see how they combine. You've got a user, you've got personal data. Again, our biggest concern is personal data, and that's not necessarily just PII. 6? Okay, good. Sorry, dyslexic. Personal data is not just the PII. It's the stuff that matters to you, right? Stuff about you that can be used in all of those things that Shanni just talked about. And so the concept of the hotspots, as Shanni said, is where indicates where in the system these threats can occur. So we combine those things that we saw on the previous screen in different ways. So we can see here we've got arrows coming into a storage, arrow going out where it says we retrieve data. We've got arrows going into a processing, arrows coming out. We process data, we send something out. By combining them in unique ways, we can identify a lot of different things. We've got inbound data into a process. We've got inbound personal data that comes from the user, goes into a process. We've got personal data marked with that P, flowing into a data store of some kind. And these aren't all the examples. There's different examples. This just shows you, illustrates that you can combine these different elements of the hotspot to illustrate certain things. And that really informs the threat discussion a lot. Processing personal data. So personal data comes into some process and out it comes to something else, right? And then just data returned to the user, which oftentimes isn't as important, but there may be examples where that is. So we want to get into we're going to get into an example of how this works in action. So LINDDUN Go, here's the rules, basic rules. A participant draws a card, everyone reads it. In this case, it's going to be Shanni and I. We consider the cards questions for each hotspot. So those questions she talked about, if we answer these questions, we can determine, all right, if the hotspot applies to the diagram in a certain place, we ask the questions. We think about the system. We talk about what the system actually does and how it behaves. So we say, all right, do these questions apply? We talk about the answers to those questions. And then we can consider, does that threat apply to this particular hotspot? And then we've identified a privacy threat. Then we just take turns going through the card deck. It's a 33 card deck, I think, of different threats across all 7 of the categories of LINDDUN. Excuse me, AV failure. The next participant then draws a card, and you continue on until all the threats have been addressed. So we'll get to that. There's a lot of words on this slide. I apologize if we can't see them in the back. Our system of choice is a public library management system, basically an online library. Everybody uses the library. I think we're all familiar with the major use cases. And this is that first step in our 4-question framework. We are going to ask the question, what are we working on? And that's not just building the diagram. We want to start, and we do this with security threat modeling as well. We want to understand what are the major use cases of the application. We want to understand the business context in which this application or system is being used. In this case, it's a public library system. We can register as a user. We can request a new library card. We can search titles. We can reserve a title. We can check out titles. We can potentially look at our borrowing history. There's 3 specific actors that we're going to call into question in here. The librarian uses this system, a registered member, somebody who is a current library card holder, but also anonymous users use the library system too. They can search for titles and see if there's something they want at the library without having to be a member. Just like you can go into the branch and just browse around and see what kind of titles are on the shelves without having to have a library card yet. Here's where things get interesting, and this is, I was thinking about this as our target for the system, and I thought, well, what is really the privacy concern of that? And I started looking up some data from the American Library Association and their stuff they have about privacy. And this is our major privacy concern as a public library, or any library. As a library, users should have the right to access and use library resources without the subject or the nature of that use being subject to examination or scrutiny by others. You shouldn't know what kind of books and titles and things, other people don't need to know that, right? The library knows that. They kind of have to know that to manage the system and the records and who's checking out what. So there's a lot of different resources and things you use in a library. We're going to kind of focus mostly on books, but this applies to anything, reserving meeting rooms, using the public computer terminals that are in your library. And their goal is to limit the degree to which personal data, including PII, but not just PII, is collected and monitored and shared and retained and transmitted. So we're all familiar with DFDs. We can move this along. Pretty straightforward. We use them in security threat modeling a lot because they're familiar to developers. They're pretty simple. They're great representation. Here's our big, crazy, giant, scary diagram of our library management system. There's all the familiar use cases from the previous slide. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the LINDDUN Go deck, and we're going to focus on some of these and hopefully be able to skip back and forth. But there's a couple of unique things that we have in here that I want you to pay attention to. On the bottom right, you'll see, most of it you'll see pretty usual stuff. The librarian can manage titles. They can update what's available on the shelves, etc. Library members can do reserve titles and things like that. And an anonymous user, as we talked about, we can search for titles, but an anonymous user can also register to get a library card. And on the right-hand side, you see where all that data may flow into data stores. Pay attention to those hotspots. You'll see a lot of them, in this case, have personal data. Again, the personal data isn't just the user's profile information or PII. It's what they're searching. It's what books they've checked out, etc. That might indicate their interest in a certain topic, and if that topic is controversial, that might be useful for a malicious actor to know. We've got a couple other things in here as well. I don't know if y'all have this. When you reserve a title, in my library, there's a self-service feature. I reserve a title, it comes into my branch, they put it on a shelf with a label on it with my name on it, right in the public area of the library. So that's why we have data showed here going to the branch printer, and that right. And being that it's 2024, we wanted our library to use some AI. We want our library to give you back book recommendations based on your search and browsing and checkout history. So we've agreed to a partnership with an external AI API provider called Books Without Borders. And we're going to send them aggregate data from our members and our anonymous users so that they can curate recommendations and titles, not just to the users, but to the librarian for titles that might need to be acquired by the library. So we're going to get out our LINDDUN card deck. We're going to see how this goes because we're running short on time, but I think we can get through this. I'm going to draw a card. And this is for linkable user requests. And the affected hotspot is inbound personal data. We saw we have a lot of that. The user requests can be linked because they contain attributes that can be combined into quasi-identifiers. So we want to look and see, do we have a place where, this is going to be hard. I'm not going to be able to go back to this.
That's okay.
Oh yeah, I can. So obviously we have this. In this particular context, we're going to kind of cheat a little bit and focus in. We might examine every one of these hotspots to see if that's affected. We're going to hone in on one that we think is particularly important, which is the anonymous user searching for titles. That the subject of their search is personal data. So what is our concerns here?
So our concerns with linking is being able to say that a user was responsible for, a specific search, right? So here.
Now they're an anonymous user in this context, right? So we don't have their identity. They're not registered with the library.
Yep.
But somebody might like to link the same user to a bunch of different requests.
So I know that a potential user, maybe in the future, maybe holds a library card now, just not logged in, is looking for books on natural remedies to chronic illnesses, right? They're interested that book exists. Maybe they go to the library and check it out, right? But they're unauthenticated when that happens. User on the same device, so browser fingerprint, 2 weeks later, checks out a book on healthy cooking, natural cooking, keto cooking, whatever. And there's a connection that can start to be made, right? You can link these two requests and say, maybe this user is trying some homeopathic remedies or some natural remedies for a chronic illness. There's no reason for anyone to be able to link those, but that's happening as a result of a browser footprint. So Chris, what's our next card?
Shanni draws.
Identifiers and data requests. So we might have an inbound user with personal data. Is that happening anywhere in our...
That's certainly happening in a lot of places. In this particular context, we're going to hone in on the inbound registered member reserving a title.
So, do we have any distinctive identifiers happening with
We
that?
do. Since you're reserving a title, you have to have your library card number, and they have your profile, which means they have your name, and they have to be able to make that title once it arrives at the branch available to you to walk in, self-service, and put that out. So we have, you want to go back to the sketch. We got to get going.
Oh, yeah.
We may only have to do a couple. We have to the right, we have that personal data being sent to a branch printer, so a label can be printed with my name. That can be then slapped by the librarian onto that title, put on a shelf in the self-service area. Is that a concern? Is that something we should worry about?
Depends if you're taking out something embarrassing.
Well, sometimes.
So now we have a non-repudiation issue, right? If I take a book out from the library, that's going to be recorded, right? It has to be recorded. What if I'm searching something? If I'm Shanni Prutchi and I'm searching for something that, like for something in on our inventory, there's no reason for that to be recorded, right? But it was recorded, and you can see, or the library can see, not just that Shanni took out a book on natural cooking, but that before that she was searching books for, chiropractic to cure my chronic illness and sleep therapy to cure my chronic illness, and is able to make connections like those, right? And so that's a concern that I may have. How about unnecessary data analysis?
Well, if you remember, so we have this processing personal data hotspot where personal data goes into some process and then goes somewhere else. And we have that squarely right here with this external API, Books Without Borders, where we're sending user search and borrowing records to this external API. But what is it doing with it? Is that necessary? Is that disclosing data that is then analyzed by a third party? Is it necessary for this system functionality? It's providing a feature that we really wanted to add to the library. Do we have concerns about that?
Well, if I can say that, I know this user belongs to this library, I now know their zip code, I know who the user is, I know what their interests are, maybe even their age, maybe their gender, and so now this can lead to linking.
And we don't know what that third party might be doing with that data that they're aggregating either,
Selling
right?
it,
Yeah.
giving it to the government, giving it to other governments.
Which leads to a different problem.
Insufficient privacy controls. When I sign up for the library app, am I given the option to opt out? Do I know that this data is being sent over
To this third party.
to this third party and what they're doing with it? I might know it's being sent over. Do I know who they're giving it to other than we have the right to give this to third parties? And if I do know, is there anything I can do about it? Can I delete my account? And when I delete my account, does that erase my history?
Good. Gonna have to whip through these.
And so how do we mitigate it? Privacy issues we mitigate with PETs, or privacy enhancing technologies. And these can be as simple as using pseudonyms to some more advanced encryption algorithms, where you can do computations on already encrypted data, where you can have different groups do work on different parts so that they don't all know different parts of the system. And really we have like some really interesting stuff that even includes like using a different style of writing so that like they can't link blog posts together. We'll be posting these slides online because these privacy enhancing techniques are like really cool and also gets into OPSEC. When we are looking at mitigating the threats that we want to deal with, we also need to think about how are we going to prioritize them. And we don't have a system like the risk rating calculator that OWASP has for privacy threats. We really need to consider the data that's sensitive, and where do we want to focus? So do we want to focus on third parties? Do we want to focus on associating titles with users, things like that? So we have 3 threats that we're going to quickly run through the mitigations. So first, we have our Books Without Borders recommendation engine. Here, the issue is that users don't necessarily know what's happening. So here it's a pretty simple mitigation, right? Just tell the user that this is happening in simple language, right? Maybe even tell them what it's being used for and allow them to opt out. You want to get better? Let them opt in. Here we have that unnecessary data analysis, right? Well, you want the data to be analyzed, but maybe you can remove an interesting piece of data that would allow later linking to happen. If I remove the library name or library location, and that can't be processed by the data engine, but still be used in a way that's helpful to the library, what if I just hash the library, right? So on the back end, the AI is able to say, okay, all these requests came from the same library, but they can't link it back to a user because they don't know the location of the user. And finally, identifying our anonymous user. There's no reason that we need to be able to have this identifying when you're taking a book from the library. There's no reason it needs to say Chris Bush is taking out How to Hunt for Bigfoot, right? Instead, Chris, when he submits his request, he can submit a pseudonym that only he can recognize, and he knows that that book is for him, like Bigfoot Lover. Or even can use the last 4 of his phone number, something that he knows that other people don't necessarily know.
All right. I know we went through that example of playing the game a little quick. Hopefully you got a flavor for what it means. Those cards really are meant to help you elicit the threats. We want to not lose sight of the last question in the 4-question framework. And the key point of that is not, when we ask, did we do a good job, it's not, is our threat modeling process good? Did we follow it correctly? Did we do everything right? It's, did the outcome help us to analyze the system, identify the privacy threats so we can improve our privacy engineering efforts to make the system better? That's really the goal of asking ourselves if we did a good job. If the answer to that is no, maybe we need to look at our process, but if the answer is yes, then it was worth doing. And that's really the essence of the 4th question. So with that, thank you. I know we went a little bit over. Sorry for that. Hope you got some value out of this. And we'll be around if you want to ask questions. I think we probably need to, we could take a couple now, maybe if there are any, or we can do it out in the hall.
We'll go after. This QR code takes you to the LINDDUN Go card deck. So you can see all 33 cards. They are also available for purchase on the same website where you can buy the Escalation of Privilege card game. I think it's Adam Shostak's store, Agile Stationery Store. The link is on the LINDDUN website. We will also be making these slides available on our personal LinkedIns. Our names are on the thing as well. You can email me. I have an OWASP email, Shanni.Prutchi, first.last @owasp.org. And we will take questions in the socialization area. Thank you for everyone's patience.
Thank you. Appreciate it, everybody.